I just did. Okay. Tarek Al-Zoughbi is a Christian Palestinian American who was raised in Bethlehem, West Bank. He received a BS in Economics and Peace Studies from Manchester University in Indiana, and his MA in International Cooperation and Development from Bethlehem University. Since 2016, he has worked as the project and youth coordinator at WIAM, the Palestinian Conflict Transformation Center. Tarek is active in civil society and has served on the executive board of the National Coalition of Christian Organizations in Palestine as the coalition's treasurer, and took part in 3 choirs and had the privilege of being part of the World Council of Churches' 12 Faces of Hope campaign. He is now working on a double MA in conflict resolution from George Mason University and Mediterranean security from the University of Malta. And he is actually residing right now in Malta. Upon completion, he looks forward to returning to Palestinian society and continuing his work with WIAM. Please give Tarek a warm Zoom welcome. Tarek?
Thank you. It's great to be with you all, and a great thank you to the organizers and to MEPN and all those who support their work. So I'm going to try and share my screen. I have a very small presentation, or very few slides, I should say. So hopefully everyone can see it. And just so that I give you an idea of how this will be organized, I will be going through some of the divisory practices and policies, and then commenting on Palestinian leadership, Palestinian peace building, and maybe lessons learned from Sulha in creating a path forward towards a positive peace that is based in justice. And so this is called the Palestinian Catch-22, which I hope will become a bit more apparent as we go through the conversation. So the first thing to talk about is the geography. And let me see if I can flip through this. There we go. So this is a very simple map of the West Bank and Gaza Strip. The West Bank being the kidney bean, the Gaza Strip, as you see, the little piece of land. And I know this is something that's familiar to many people in the audience, but I thought it would be a good starting point to contextualize these issues of sovereignty and to begin to dispel some of the normative assumptions and presumptions that are pervasive when we talk about Palestinian leadership. And so what we see here is first a division amongst the Palestinian people between those residing in the West Bank, those residing within Israel, and then those residing within the Gaza Strip. And then we move on to the division between Palestinians and Israelis. So this is one of the signs that many of you have likely to have seen if you were able to visit Palestine, Israel. And it's one of the signs that you'll see as you enter the West Bank areas of A and B predominantly in the West Bank under the Palestinian Authority, in which it outlines that this is an area that is illegal for Israeli citizens to enter. And this is an important point because when we look at the history of Palestine, Israel, we talk about a more interconnected economic dimension in the past, especially prior to the Oslo Accords, where the Palestinian market hub of Hebron and some businesses within Jericho were heavily dependent on the continued and continuous movement of Israeli citizens, of Israeli Jewish citizens, into these markets and interaction, economic interaction with them. Something that has changed since the Oslo Accords, since the building of the wall, and since the continuous expansion of the settlement movements. Then when we talk about this division or these divisory practices, we also talk about intra-division. And so this is the West Bank again. This is a map from the United Nations OCHA office. And you will probably notice that it's been flipped a bit, and that's so that you can get a better picture of it. But all of these yellow and darker, maybe orange blocks, those are territories or lands of Area A and B under the Palestinian Authority's control. The remaining areas are Israeli-controlled territories. And what's important is this map is to see the division, the Swiss cheese of these territories, and the geographical separation that exists between these Palestinian communities, not just between the West Bank, the Israeli-controlled territories, and Israel and the Gaza Strip, but also within the territories of the West Bank, where the Palestinian communities continue to be alienated from each other. And this alienation isn't simply between cities of the West Bank, as in this map of Bethlehem, it's also between communities of the same city or governance. So you can see these blots of darker pink, darker purple, and light purple that separate the Palestinian communities from themselves. And this is then further heightened by the wall, which doesn't simply separate Palestinians from Israelis, but also Palestinians from Palestinians, and oftentimes the wall is built within the area of A, B, and C of the West Bank, mostly Area C, and it separates Palestinian territory from itself. So this is a picture of WEAM, the Center for Palestinian Conflict Transformation that I work with, or I'm part of, and this wall actually was able to take 1/4 to 1/3 of the land that the center would have operated on. So it's also a wall that's built in between or on and through the territories of Palestinians, sometimes dividing and separating the land and rendering pieces of that land inaccessible, such as here, where the loss of that piece of land has been unrecognized and that land continues to be inaccessible, which is very important when we talk about the Palestinian population, which continues to rapidly grow while the land that is accessible to Palestinians continues to shrink, which adds or augments the grievances felt by Palestinians through the pressures and the stresses that are added by the rise of prices of land and the difficult and strenuous economic reality. So moving from here, we're going to briefly talk about citizenship. There are 3 different versions of citizenship that a Palestinian can have. And maybe it's better to use the word identity instead of citizenship. The first one in the green with the Palestinian passport, that is the citizenship or identity cards that is given to Palestinians of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. These citizenships allow us to simply move unless we have extenuating circumstances or Israeli military permission to only move within the areas that are designated for us, such as Area A and B in the West Bank, or the areas of the Gaza Strip that are within the Palestinian-controlled territories, and not to move in between them. So West Bankers can move freely within Area A and B of the West Bank under normal conditions, and Gazans can move in the territories controlled by the Gazan representatives, by Hamas, by the Palestinian Authority in Gaza. The other one that you see coming from the symbol of Al-Aqsa Mosque, representing East Jerusalem, is that of Jerusalem residents. And this is a group of Palestinians who are not citizens by the law. They are neither Palestinian or Israeli by the Israeli law, which welcomes them, and I use the word welcome here sparingly, as immigrants to Jerusalem. And they fall under 2 types of residency, one which is permanent and one which is temporary. And each residency status has different stipulations, such as those who are temporary residents have to continue to prove that Jerusalem is the center of their livelihood, and they have to utilize or use enough utilities to formulate or to prove that Jerusalem is the center of their livelihood, and that residency may be taken away. You will see with this that there is this Jordanian passport, and that is because they only have the right to 2 types of passports, one which is a travel document, and the other one which is a Jordanian passport, which in the first pages states that this is not proof of citizenship, because Jordanian law treats them as Palestinian citizens, which they have no legal entitlement to. But these people, or these identity holders, differ from those of the West Bank because they have the right to movement within the geographical territories of the West Bank and the Israeli-controlled territories and Israel. And they are similar to the Israeli citizens, except the biggest difference is they have no right to election. They have no right to vote outside of municipal or local elections. For the Israeli citizen, they have the right to traverse the areas, predominantly of the West Bank, the Israeli-controlled territories, and Israel, and their citizenship cannot be revoked. So this difference relates to many of the rights, but it also finds itself affecting the economic security and economic livelihood of people. As here are some figures that come from the economics Nobel Prize winner, an Israeli economist, Joshua Angrist, in which he finds that the average monthly income for Palestinians under the Palestinian Authority is around 2,500 shekels a month, while the average monthly income, which also accounts for the Gaza Strip, is around 2,000 shekels. Whereas if you have the legal right to work within the Israeli-controlled territories, or if you have the ability to work in the Israeli-controlled territories. And that distinction is simply because there's 110,000 Palestinian workers with the legal right to traverse the checkpoints and work within the Israeli-controlled territories and Israel. And here it's important to say that when I refer to the Israeli-controlled territories, I speak of the territories that fall under Israeli military rule, but fall outside of the Green Line, such as many of the settlements and many of the road networks. And the average income for unskilled Palestinian labor grows to 5,500 to 6,000 shekels a month, whereas for skilled labor, it becomes around 10,000 shekels. And so one of the questions may be, what determines who has the ability to work in which area? And it is identity, citizenship, and then the ability to receive military permits. At the moment, there are around 15 various types of Israeli military permits, some of which allow you to work. The strongest permit is those that are given for the purposes or in which a Palestinian is designated as a member of a church body or organization. And then you have other work permits that simply allow the Palestinian worker to cross the checkpoints and work within the Israeli-controlled territories or Israel within certain hours on certain days. And that one is a costly permit ranging from 2,000 to 3,000 shekels a month to receive that right of work. And so we can already see that a person who is making 10,000 shekels may also pay 1/3 of their salary for the right to access a higher paying job within the Israeli-controlled territories and Israel. And so here I have a picture of my family after the wedding of my brother. And one of the reasons this is here is because when we talk about identity and citizenship, we also talk about borders. And so it is important to say for any Palestinian to leave or access Palestine, Israel, save for Gaza because of Egypt, they have to receive Israeli exit and entry permits. So the woman in the blue dress next to the bride, that is my mother, who is an American citizen, who has been married to my father, who is next to her since 1990, but yet have been able to practice the right to live together and have yet to have the right to family unification. In fact, since 1990 up until 2018, she was living on the same types of visas that are granted to international visitors until in 2018, she was formally, or in 2019, she left in October of 2018, came back in April of 2019 to enjoy Easter with her family and prepare for my brother's wedding, in which she was detained in Ben Gurion Airport and kicked out. And after a set of negotiations and using high-profile members of the Palestinian community, of the international community, we were able to guarantee that she will be able to come and join us for the wedding, and she was able or granted access to Areas A and B only of the Palestinian territories, which by the Oslo Accords fall under Palestinian jurisdiction 3 days before the wedding and only after the payment of 70,000 shekels, which is equivalent to 35 months at the average income per month within the Palestinian territories, including the Gaza Strip. And now she relies on COGAT, which is one of the agencies that is connected to the Israeli military that serves the administrative needs of the West Bank, which are referred to Judea and Samaria. And my mother continues to be one out of 30,000 families that continue to ask for the right to family unification. But this simply doesn't extend to people who are married or people who have been married in the past. My brother and his wife tried to come to Palestine this summer, and upon trying to enter, my brother's wife comes from the USA. She has US citizenship and doesn't have Palestinian citizenship, which is important to note. They were told that she will also, similar to my mother, have to apply for the right to come and visit her ancestral home because she's also Palestinian on both sides of her parents. And so they now belong to the growing 30,000 families that have yet to give up on the right to family unification. And recently in June and July of this year, a new Israeli policy stipulated that any international visitor coming to the territories who is romantically engaged in a relationship with a Palestinian must disclose this to the Israeli authorities upon entry, or they could be denied entry and they will be going against the Israeli law. So from here, we talk a little bit about Palestinian leadership. Why was that context important? It's to try and show the disparities in sovereignty and the minimal limited sovereignty that the Palestinian Authority is able to use. Oftentimes when we speak about the Palestinian Authority or Palestinian leadership, there is this normative assumption that one of the reasons the Palestinian people continue to live under occupation is because they simply do not have a good or a strong model of leadership or strong leaders. And this is here where it's important to dispel that first assumption by carefully and consciously affirming the right of all people to live freely without occupation, regardless of leadership and regardless of government authorities and government. And so when we talk about Palestinian leadership, we talk about two main leaderships. In the West Bank, we talk about the Palestinian Authority under Fatah. The Palestinian Authority was first recognized during the Oslo Accords from 93 to 95 with their formal recognition as the authority of the Palestinian people in 94. And from 94 until 2004, 2005 with Arafat's death, they maintained some form of limited governance and sovereignty of Palestinian territories in the Gaza Strip, but mostly and especially within the West Bank. And this sovereignty was limited to the security needs of Israel and to the stipulations and agreements set forth within the Oslo Accords, which include no sovereignty over land borders and no sovereignty over the imports and exports of Palestinian products, which have to go through the Israeli systems and oftentimes the Israeli taxation to leave and enter the territories. After Arafat's death in 2004, there was a call, especially from the international community, for democratic elections, which led to the 2006 elections in which Hamas won the majority of the legislative council seats. This resulted in outcry from the international community, especially the Western international community, which for the most part viewed and framed Hamas as a terrorist network and organization. And then there were threats of pooling and cutting aid. And so the Palestinian Authority and the Fatah majority, especially as it related to the West Bank, had the decision between having a unified democratic leadership that was democratically elected or having the finances to be able to continue its operations and have any form of legitimacy or any small amount of legitimacy that it has been granted. And this led to an escalation of violence, which culminated within 2007 and led to the division between the West Bank under the PA and Fatah and Gaza under Hamas. And it's important when we talk about Hamas that during the late 70s and 80s, Hamas came out of the Muslim Brotherhood, which was banned in Egypt under Sheikh Yassin. And then through the support of Israel, it was able to create this leadership until it created its formal charter in 1988. And in 1988, this charter made no difference between Judaism and Zionism. And so it was largely seen as anti-Semitic. It related to Palestinian liberation, but without the careful distinction between Israel as a political entity and Judaism as a religion and as a people. And so in 2017, Hamas amended its charter to carefully explain that it targets Zionism and the practices, the illegal practices of the Israeli occupation and the Israeli state, and not Judaism. And the reason that this is important is because what we see in the West Bank is there is a growing support for Hamas, and in the Gaza Strip, we see a growing support for Fatah. And this simply speaks to the ineffectiveness of both of these leaderships, which is limited, of course, by their sovereignty and by their limited sovereignty and rule, which brings us to the Palestinian prisoners. Even though there is a Palestinian Legislative Council member, Israel has a system of political imprisonment and administrative detentions. So at the moment, there are 4,700 Palestinian political prisoners with 800 administrative detainees. Now, the difference between the two is when you go to an administrative detention center, you do not have right to a lawyer and you do not have the right to know what you are accused of, because it is basically this very high extreme interrogation in the name of security, where they can hold any Palestinian, regardless of age and sex, up to 6 months, renewable up to 60 months in the name of security, which does not have to be disclosed for security purposes. Once you have been formally accused of a crime, you have the legal right to lawyers, and then you move from the administrative detentions to the courts, and then if you're found guilty, you move from the administrative detention centers to the Israeli political prisons. And so at the moment, there are 6 Palestinian Legislative Council members who are currently held in these prisons, and there are 551 of the 4,700 Palestinian political prisoners who are serving life sentences, including some who are serving multiple life sentences. And of the prisoners, there's currently 190 children and 30 women. And this is where identity and citizenship becomes important again. If you're a Palestinian of the West Bank, you have different legal rights and obligations under the Israeli military law than if you are a Palestinian citizen of Israel. And one of these differences is in reference to who is a child. Under the Israeli civil law, a child is any person under the age of 18. Under Israeli military law, which is only enforced on Palestinians, a child is anyone who is under the age of 16. And that's a very important distinction. And so from here, we talk about peace building and activism. A 2017 study done by the Palestinian Central for Bureau Statistics found that around 88% of all Palestinians wish to immigrate, with around 26% of these Palestinians wishing to immigrate permanently, and another 62% wishing to immigrate temporarily. And so these are Palestinians who have largely, at least in mental form, left Palestinian society and who see future and who see a secure future and semblances of security abroad, internationally. They no longer see it in Palestine. And so these are people who largely leave and become less active within Palestinian community and Palestinian society. And so when we talk about Palestinian activism, it's important to note that the Palestinian community was very active with popular resistance and nonviolent resistance. Oops, let's try and go back. And in the Oslo Accords, there was this feeling of extreme hopefulness. Finally, the Palestinian people were receiving some form of recognition, and we were able to have our voices heard. And then we have the next 5 years of the Oslo Accords, when it becomes quite clear that the Palestinian leadership didn't necessarily know what it was agreeing to during the Oslo Accords, or the second part of this is that it doesn't have the right or the sovereignty to be able to practice leadership, to practice the protections that are supposed to be given or granted by its entity, by this government. And so we have this buildup of aspirational depravity, this buildup of grievances, which resulted in the 2002 uprising or intifada, during which time Palestinian activism, Palestinian resistance, Palestinian uprising was met with quite harsh Israeli policies and occupational violence and political violence. And so one of the things that the Palestinian community learned was that of collective punishment. And now we move into neoliberal Palestine, in which Palestine becomes the NGO capital of the world, with Ramallah being that capital. And with this influx and outflow of money and of funding and of projects relating to the Palestinian community and society, but very few of it designated or focused on liberation or on Palestinian freedom and sovereignty. And so what we have is, again, the map continues to shrink for Palestinians, as especially Area C is around 62%, with 38% of Area A and B of the West Bank being that which is accessible for Palestinians, especially as it relates to building. And so we see this land continue to decrease, the Palestinian people continue to grow and increase, and simple supply and demand, we see the prices of land continue to increase, and we see the Palestinian culture move from that which was heavily agricultural to now a culture which is reliant on building complexes and apartments because of the shrinking spaces and the high prices. We also see Palestinian culture moving from a one working household member to now all members of the household working, especially the man and the woman in traditional households, for the purposes of meeting month's end, especially when we speak of this disparity in economics. And it's important to note that the costs of living are similar between the West Bank and within Israel, especially because so many of the Palestinian products or products within the Palestinian market come from Israel or come with heavy taxation from countries like Jordan and Turkey. And so you have this buildup of tension. You have this yearning for sovereignty, which is unable to be realized or materialized yet, which adds to this buildup, to this grievances, and it turns inward. We begin to exercise control on the Palestinians or on the people that we can access, and that is Palestinians within our community. And this adds to the cycle of displaced anger, which we face within our community, which very simply put, you have a job in Israel, you go to the checkpoint, you suffer humiliation, you do your job, you come home, you take out your frustrations on your family. Oftentimes in this very simple model, on your wife, then your wife takes out her frustrations on the children, and now the children act violently towards each other. And now the cycle continues. And so part of peace building in Palestine now is focusing on intra-Palestinian society peace building, focusing on being able to stop the cycle in its tracks, to disrupt this cycle and build Palestinian community again. Because in this reality of occupation, and when we speak about these leaderships, we speak about leaderships which by the Oslo Accords, save for the Gaza Strip, which is a bit of a special case, are forced to remain in their buildings and not interact or not go out to the streets when the Israeli military invades into the Palestinian territories. And just in terms of statistics, since the beginning of 2022, we have had 164 Palestinian martyrs, 110 of which have been civilians, 33 children, 8 women, and a little around 7,700 plus Israeli military raids or invasions within the West Bank, and with around 50 of them, or 26 of them, sorry, being within the Gaza Strip. And so we speak about a leadership that is ineffective in being able to grant protection to its people, which adds to the grievances felt by the Palestinian community. So peace building becomes an intra-focus. And so we focus on building Palestinian harmony and community, building this civil peace, because we begin to practice and believe that Palestinian existence is the strongest form of resistance that we have. And so WeAm is just an example of one of these models of intra-Palestinian society peace building as a means of resistance, where WeAm focuses on the tradition of Sulha, Palestinian conflict mediation. And through that program, it went from being reactive to proactive, wanting to go from where there is conflict, mediating it, to how can we limit the rise of conflict or dispel it in its roots before it even begins. And so they focused on women's empowerment work, focusing on social, political, and economic empowerment, understanding that if a woman continues to be economically dependent on her male patriarchs or male counterparts, then her independence is limited to the ideology of those male counterparts. We also focus on youth. Again, that 88% figure which wishes to leave, which moves away from Palestinian society, trying to allow them to envision or have glimpses of hope and hopefulness within the Palestinian community, and this desire to interact with the Palestinian community, especially through grassroots and civil organizations and networks, to build community and to be empowered within that community, understanding that we may be a bit powerless as it relates to influencing positive political change or practices of sovereignty, but we are quite powerful as it relates to building community and building just communities that are inclusive and allow for the growth of all members of its community. We also focus on children, especially within the areas that are close to Area C or close to the wall and the checkpoints and military bases, which suffer very high rates of violence. In fact, in a 2017 study on youth, it was found that 20% of youth had first and direct contact with violence or physical violence. In a 2000 study done by Jackaman and other academics focusing on 10th and 11th graders, they found that 15% of those 10th and 11th graders had been beaten by soldiers, and that a staggering 60% had suffered tear gas. And this is just from the Ramallah area, which is seen as one of the less tense areas of the West Bank. And with 80% of them experiencing shooting, usually at strangers or at friends and relatives and neighbors. And so a very high rise in violence, but also this idea that violence becomes more normative. It becomes more normalized the more you are forced or able to interact with it. And so we again see this rise of violence within the Palestinian community, which works to further fragment. So we focus on these youth and we focus on these children so that we are able to help these children and youth lead lives that aren't characterized by the trauma that they've accumulated or the violence that they've experienced or witnessed, but instead by their dreams, their goals, and their aspirations. And so we practice this form of resistance through building Palestinian cohesion and Palestinian community. But as it relates to activism against the occupation directly, it's important to note that power disparities, especially as it relates to border and border control, and the cost of being active. I mentioned again my mother and our unique family situation, which is only unique to her as an American, but not unique to Palestinian families, especially Palestinians with foreign internationals or expatriates as spouses. And we find that Israel practices this form of collective punishment. In fact, one of the things my mother asked when she was at Ben Gurion Airport was, "You are treating me in a very different way, a very unusual way than you would treat most Americans," to which a security guard replied, "You are married to a Palestinian." But also because of our family's activism and our work in peace building, intra-Palestinian community, and this focus on activism, we can't help but wonder how much of the added struggles come as direct punishment from this activism. And we also see, as it relates to protests, as it relates to any forms of Palestinian activism, oftentimes, especially as the Palestinian may be detained, then the family may also suffer repercussions of that activism, regardless of whether it is violent or non-violent. And so this all adds to these feelings of hopelessness, which also create feelings of disempowerment. And so here is kind of where I end the depressing version or the depressing part of this talk, and we try and instill a bit of hopelessness to show some light in these bleak situations. And so now I will talk about Sulha and lessons. So as part of WEAN's programming, I've been able to work with conflict mediation based in the Palestinian Arab tradition of Sulha, which also mixes Western forms and traditions of mediation. And there are a few things that my engagement in Sulha has taught me as a model for peace building. And the first being the end of aggression. It is very important in Sulha, like many Western methodologies of reconciliation, of conflict transformation, there is an important step that is needed in order to be able to create or begin the process of mediation. And that step is the end of aggression, but also the rebalancing of power. And so the first important step is the end of aggression, and that once we are able to take truces, once we are able to stop any forms of violence, is when we are able to have meetings and when we are able to begin the reconciliation and the conflict transformation process. But the other part comes soon after, and that is truth-speaking recognition. And that is oftentimes the recognition of the ill that I have perpetuated against my neighbor, against my friend, against my sibling, family member, against whoever it may be. And one very important part of this is the greater the truth speaking, the easier and more effective the reconciliation and transformation process is. And this recognition does not come with stipulations. It does not come with limitations. It comes with honesty in hopes that there is a generous human spirit that will practice mercy. And so we oftentimes see in this practice that the greatest impasses in conflict transformation are overcome when the side that has committed the most aggression or the most violence is able to say, hey, we have wronged you, we have done this, it was not right, it was wrong, it was hurtful, and we apologize, and we are now at your mercy. And that is oftentimes when this human spirit of generosity, of kindness, of love, and of connection is awakened, and we see the other side begin the healing process through that recognition, but also begin to practice generosity, begin to practice understanding, knowing that the explanation of violence and the grievances behind the actions and the violent actions do not justify this violence, but they help explain it, but they also help humanize these actors, especially these violent actors. And then from there, we have the conclusion of these processes, which works to consciously rebalance the power through cooperation, through togetherness, and redress past injustices, especially past injustices which help promote and help keep the status quo of this disparity of power. And so when we talk about the Israeli occupation and Palestinian society, or the Israeli state and the Palestinian leadership, the Palestinian Authority, it's important to say that one of the reasons these negotiations fail is because there is no balancing of power. One of the things you'll hear Palestinian speakers oftentimes say time and time again is that one of the problems is that when we come to the table of negotiations, we are not at the table, but instead on the table. And that's because of the limited power and sovereignty that we are able to exercise. And so our role on the table instead becomes a negotiation of our already limited sovereignty and rights, instead of a negotiation towards justice and towards positive peace building. But the other part is, if we look at Western media especially, but of media coverage of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, it is oftentimes framed as a zero-sum game. Palestinians are largely seen as aggressive, as violent, oftentimes portrayed as coming from this anti-Semitic and violent culture. But then the idea of Palestinian rights is oftentimes framed at the expense of Israeli security, which is a very false notion. And so part of our work in truth speaking is not simply to speak of the histories, to speak of the atrocities that all people have experienced, to begin the healing processes for Palestinians. That means looking at the Nakba, looking at the Naksa, looking at the Intifadas and the continuous military occupation practices and policies, and the humiliation that Palestinians face, and begin to heal that wound. But it also means looking at this history of anti-Semitism, especially that has been experienced and suffered in the West, because there is very little room for healing from this trauma or from any trauma when we are forced into combat. There's very little room for healing when we are holding a weapon and actively engaged in conflict. But the other part of this truth speaking is speaking the truth of this process and formulating Palestinian rights not at the expense of Israeli security, but instead as complementary to Israeli security, understanding that violence is rooted in these grievances, and it does not justify violence on any side, but it helps to explain it, and that security can never come at the expense of another people's right or another people's sovereignty or livelihood, but instead security comes with and through the building of these relationships and the building of confidence measures which allow all people to live and lead a life of self-determination. And so, some of the basic ingredients of this positive peace that we call for, and here it's important again to begin with that end of aggression. The road to peace does not begin or end with negotiations, but it begins with the end of occupation. And then negotiations can begin, or healthy negotiations that work towards a positive and sustainable peace can begin. And within that, some of the basic ingredients of the Palestinian community, I believe, are the recognition of the histories and the traumas, and equal rights regardless of citizenship. People, and especially discourse on this issue, oftentimes becomes trapped in this one state versus two state versus different federacies conversation or discourse. And what is more important than how the system appears or is created is what the system entails. And here the system must entail equal rights and equal access. And this equal access is equal access to the land. There is no reason that Palestinians who have this strong tie with the land, alongside their Jewish brothers and sisters and others who have this strong tie to the land, should not be able to enjoy the entirety of that land. But they should be able to do that without hurting the other, and without being privileged by one system of law or practices. And that also includes this equal rights, that they should be able to have the same rights regardless of what type of governance structure they live under, and regardless of in which territory they are in under a non-one state solution. And the last part of this is these confidence building measures. To be able to heal the past, we must also recognize that there is a loss of trust, that there is a disruption in the relationship, and that we cannot build that relationship very easily or very quickly, but instead we must build it one brick, one block at a time. And so some of these confidence building measures may appear as allowing the different communities to practice life and to practice sovereignty and the right to self-determination with the facts, but also with the ending of occupation, to be able to truly practice these rights. And from there, as people who are free, to be able to come at the table as equals to build a path forward in which the dignities and rights of all people are preserved. And so I think I am exactly on time, and I'll end this talk here, and I will hand it back to Janet. And thank you for listening, and I look forward to any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Tarek. Wow, that is 1.5 tons of information. And I think what I'm going to do is listen to the recording again to get it thoroughly. We really appreciate this. It is time for the Q&A portion of our webinar. I see one question. If others have questions, please put them in the Q&A and I will read them as they come through. The first one has a long preface to the question itself. So here we go. Surely some organization can stop Israel from committing all these crimes against the Palestinians. We cannot depend on the international community because the US exerts its influence, vetoes UN security resolutions, and gives Israel total impunity to continue all of these violations. So how do we stop this illegal, brutal, violent regime, enact massive sanctions against them, and ostracize them and bring them to their knees, like Miko Peled suggests? We had Miko on a few months ago, Tarek. You probably know who he is. The UN have the responsibility to act and do not. They are cowards and makes me think of double standards when compared to with Ukraine. There it is.
Well, thank you, Tina, for this very, very small question. No, thank you for this very important question. And I think you made some very good points. And I think a quick comment first before I answer is that one of the things we believe in, especially at WEAM, is that we do not wish to bring Israel to its knees, but instead bring it to its senses. And that is part of our practice of conflict transformation, in which we want to bring the strong to their senses and not to their knees, while empowering the weak to their feet, in a sense. And yes, the US exerts major influence, but unfortunately, the occupation is also wrapped up with an industrial military complex. And so we continue to be reliant and dependent on the international community, and specifically on the USA, on Western Europe, and on the United Nations. So when we talk about Israel and we talk about every war on Gaza, one of the reasons that these wars are so important is because part of Israel's strong industrial military complex is its ability to stamp its weapons with the seal of battle proven, which means that they have tested it out and they have tried it out, and oftentimes on Palestinians of the Gaza Strip, but every now and then also of the West Bank. And so part of what I believe is needed is this change of normative understandings or acceptances within each of our community. We operate under governments and we belong to governments which have these legislations that restrict our ability to hurt each other, especially as it relates to violence and to murder, but somehow gives this exact right, or allows different organizations such as the police, such as the military, and such as the government to practice this right with impunity and sometimes limited impunity. And so it creates this normative assumption that there are various circumstances in which certain people may qualify for hurt, for injustice. Or another way of rephrasing this is that certain injustices are justified. And so I think what is needed is a change and an affirmation that no injustice is ever justified. And we need to begin to work from within our national and our local governments, regardless of where we are, to practice that right and then to call for that right to be recognized and to be written down as part of the legislation. And then we can call upon our governments to act and to be involved in other forms or cycles of oppression and of injustice elsewhere. And so within this, people are powerful, and the whole idea of depending on the international community comes from this idea that many of the international communities belong to democracies, regardless of the technicalities of these democracies, and that at some levels, oftentimes starting with the grassroots and local levels, that there is limited and hopefully growing power of these individuals and of this community to affirm the right of people to live, to exist, to live freely. And from their working from the bottom up and hopefully influencing change on the top level, which I think for the US is to call upon the US to honor the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, to honor the international humanitarian law, and honor all these rights of people to self-determination, and call not for negative repercussions or the furthering of injustice by answering injustice with injustice, but instead calling upon especially state actors to act with justice, and when they go against our foundations of justice, to limit our economic ties with them, especially as it relates to US military aid to Israel and as it relates to the Israeli lobby within the United States.
Thank you, Tarek. Another question from one of our new board members: who or what rules the West Bank today and how?
So that is another difficult and technical question, because the legal authority of the West Bank is the Palestinian Authority, which is predominantly Fatah at the moment. But as it relates to the actual practice of ruling, it relates to day-to-day interactions. Part of the Oslo Accords and the Paris Protocols is that the Palestinian Authority cannot engage with the Israeli military when they must enter, invade, or raid the West Bank for security purposes, which do not have to be disclosed. And when we talk about the role of the Palestinian Authority within the West Bank, it is very limited in its scope to oftentimes civilian administration, but not border control.
Thank you. A question in the chat: does the presence of NGOs in the big cities indicate a desire by outsiders for normalization?
Well, thank you for that question. It can. It does not necessarily mean that, but it oftentimes does reflect Western intervention in intra-society Palestinian dealings. So we have many organizations that are willing to support the economic or the social and political empowerment of women, but very few, especially Western organizations, who will allow us to engage with women or communities across the West Bank. Sometimes our engagement must be stipulated and must be based on their political activity or lack of political activity, but it oftentimes also results in a sort of globalization and continued Western colonization through the influence of funding, which supports programming that is majorly made up of Western ideals and values and notions of empowerment.
That kind of brings me to the issue of some of these organizations that are now being outlawed by the Israeli government, that seem to have humanitarian intentions and goals, and yet they are being banned. Is there any correlation, or would you like to address that issue at all?
Yes, yes, thank you for that. So I think the ones that you're referring to are the 6 most recent ones who are in one way or another either affiliated through membership or through political allegiance with the Popular Front or the Communist Socialist Palestinian Party, which has been described and formulated as a terrorist organization, such as Hamas in the West, especially in Washington, which also includes members of the PA. But we also see for many different organizations, I know that MEPN supports the BDS movement.
Yes, absolutely.
And so BDS is one of those movements that has been framed as anti-Semitic. And we see many organizations, even as ourselves, as we have some funding that comes from our Canadian partners. And part of those funding agreements is that we have to sign papers or documents stating that we will not use any portion or proportion of this funding to support BDS initiatives, because BDS is framed as anti-Semitic and framed as violent. And so we see many organizations blacklisted and we see organizations raided. WeAm is situated in Area C of Bethlehem, and in the backdrop of WeAm, we have one of the 3 refugee camps in Bethlehem, Ida Refugee Camp, and we have partners and friends within those camps who are continuously raided by the Israeli authorities. But this isn't simply exclusive to Palestinian organization. It also includes Israeli human rights organizations, such as Beit Salem, which is the leading Israeli human rights organization, one of the leading organizations that refers to Israel and its practices as an apartheid, which if you go and visit them, you have to go through this 2-doored security where you come into this, again, this NGO, you get into the first door, it closes behind you, the second door in front of you is locked, and then they make sure that you aren't armed or that you're not a risk to their NGO, to their network, and then they allow you in. And that's because of the many raids that the Israeli police and military have committed against them. And of course, within this raids, you have the destruction of property, but you also have the loss of data. You have the loss of reports, and every now and then you have the freezing of assets, such as what Sabeel and many other organizations experienced when BDS was formulated in the city of Jerusalem as illegal. And we saw the change in Israeli policy as it related to religious institutions, which also culminated in the closing of the Holy Church Sepulchre's doors on Easter, I believe around 2 years ago. And so we see that this threat continues. If you look up WeAm, or if you look up my name, if you look up any member of WeAm's name online, you will see different articles and sometimes local newspapers claiming that we are anti-Semitic and asking for different actors and supporters, and especially organizations in the West, to end their relationship with us and end any funding when there is funding.
Thank you for that. And next question. Well, actually, before I do the next question, I will read a comment. Thank you, Tarek, for this excellent and very informative and hopeful presentation, all delivered in your very pleasing singer's voice. I didn't want to overlook that. All right, next question. Can you speak about the causes of rapidly decreasing number of Christians in Palestine and why that is less so for Muslims?
Yeah. So when we talk about the Palestinian Christian community, it's important that we start at the Ottoman Empire. Under the Ottoman Empire until 1858, it was largely difficult and illegal for religious minorities to own private property, which resulted in many Palestinian Christians moving from that agricultural practice, moving to the cities and becoming merchants. And so then in the early 1900s, especially in 1909, 1910, when the Ottoman Empire was practicing conscription and forced conscription on not just the Muslim Palestinians, but all Palestinians, Many Christian Palestinians were able to network or channel through the networks that they had created through this merchant practice, especially with networking with the West, and especially Christians from the West who were coming for pilgrimage to the Palestinian territories and were able to leave in mass numbers, especially from the Bethlehem area, from the Ramallah area, from Jerusalem, Nazareth, from the Christian centers within the Palestinian society. And so when we talk about today, there is an estimated 46,000 Palestinian Christians living in the entirety of the Palestinian territories of the Gaza Strip, East Jerusalem, and the West Bank, where just in Chile and Honduras alone, there's an estimated 500,000 Palestinians who are predominantly Christian. But continuing with rampant Islamophobia and with rampant xenophobia, oftentimes when we talk about the Palestinian who has less barriers to their ability to practice their right or to practice the choice and desire to immigrate, we see many more Christian Palestinians, especially through these networks and channels, being able to leave the Palestinian territories in greater number than we do see for our Muslim brothers, sisters, and others. And the other part to include in this is also when it comes to the Palestinian population, we grow at a much smaller number because of familial practices than our Muslim brothers and sisters do. And so we also grow at different rates. But at the moment, if the Palestinian people, and especially the Palestinian youth, had their way, we would see declining numbers across the board, with 88% of our youth and youth designated as between the ages of 16 to 30 wishing and expressing a desire to leave the land, the territories, the country, and pursue a future and a more secure future elsewhere, predominantly in the Arab Gulf, the North Americas, and then Western Europe.
Thank you. The next question. I am touched by your unique perspective. Would you mind sharing how you came to it? I think we know. It's in the blood. Have you found young Israeli partners?
Thank you very much. So I should say that I grew up deeply influenced by my parents. My mother belongs to the Church of the Brethren, which is one of the historical peace churches. And my father was a Palestinian activist, also belonging to the Christian community. But I grew up learning about how nonviolence is very powerful, to the extent that I heard stories of my father as a young man collecting these books, which were outlawed and banned. And these books were Western classics, but they were also books on civil disobedience, on nonviolence, and on civil disobedience as a means of resistance. But what was not on the list was books about weaponry or mass destruction or creating bombs. And so it became very clear that nonviolence was a greater threat to the state or of Israel, as we know it, as an occupying colonial force, than was violence. And then this all continued to grow as I saw the difficulties of my parents to live with each other and to be in the same country, to live in the same house, to live in their own home. And then as I grew older, I took part in various activities that brought together Israelis and Palestinians for the purposes of peace. And this is where I solidified my understanding or my perspective of Palestine and Israel, not as a conflict between people. And that is largely because the Jewish Israeli people, except for the settlers, don't have continuous interaction with the Palestinian community. It's oftentimes the Palestinian people with the Israeli machine, with the Israeli occupation, with the state, with the soldiers who are armed with weapons, of course, shared or told this narrative that the Palestinians will throw them in the sea, that they will kill them, not speaking the language, not understanding the culture, and at the age of 18 and 19, forced to move. Instead of going to the beach and hang out with their boyfriends, girlfriends, or studying, they're forced to carry these weapons and go to places that they've never been, never lived, with this idea that they are in danger. And so it became very clear to me that the way forward was through affirmation of rights and through the focus on healing. Especially, it is very easy to understand why the average Jewish Israeli may feel threatened or may feel scared, whether there is true danger or not. Especially when we talk about anti-Semitism, if you Google synagogue attacks, you will likely find many sources in which they show synagogue attacks in the West, not within Israel or not within Palestine, Israel. But there is this history, especially with the Second World War and the atrocities of the Holocaust, in which Jews have been disadvantaged and which they have been marginalized and which they have been brutally murdered. And so it's very easy to create this environment of fear. And then when you arm that environment of fear with a weapon, it becomes very easy to become hostile and aggressive. And one of the things that I also learned through Sulha, which added to my perspective, was that we cannot bring aggressive actors who continue to practice this aggression with those who have this aggression inflicted upon them. And this can be on average, it can be in any terms that we speak of, and hope for a process that is effective, that is helpful, and that is healthy. And this is where there is the need to end all aggressions first, and to change and reframe these normative assumptions and understandings that we have, and affirm that no injustice justifies another injustice. And that is to say that injustice must be something that is never justified, especially as we are all rational actors. And through my studies of conflict resolution, one of the foundations is that we are rational actors even when we do use violence, which is to say that violence is always rooted in experiences of grievances, in intention, and in some logical framework. And to dismiss violence as cultural, or to dismiss it as simply any defining feature such as terrorism and end the conversation there, is to do or to further the injustice, limit our understanding, but also create this normative approach to dealing with this injustice through further injustice and marginalization of these groups.
Thank you. What you just said is certainly, we hear, especially in the Twin Cities where the George Floyd movement began, the violence was definitely a result of the ultimate in frustration. And that's basically what you're talking about. I'm also reminded many years ago, the very first group that I escorted to Palestine, we were in Jericho and met with Yasser Arafat's PR person. His name is Sami Musalem. You probably know him. And his statement was, "You treat a person like a dog long enough and he becomes one." And I never forgot that statement. And you have addressed that issue, of course, with violence, even within Palestinian families. The cycle just continues. Something WIAM is working to end that cycle.
Yep.
All right, I pontificate. What is the difference between Area B and Area C?
Yeah, so thank you. So the division of Area A, B, and C came with the Oslo Accords. Area A was supposed or is under Palestinian authority for both security enforcement and legislation. Area B was supposed to be shared between the Palestinian Authority and the Israeli state. And then Area C falls under Israeli military authority. And in Area C, you have two predominant populations, one being the Jewish settler population, which falls under Israeli civil law. And then you have the Palestinian diminishing population of Area C, which falls under Israeli military law. And so Area B was supposed to be mixed until after 5 years after the Oslo Accords, in which it would become de facto Area A. So Area C, which makes around 62%, 61 point something percent of the West Bank, remains in one way or another under Israeli military control, where Israel is responsible for security enforcement, but also for the legislation, which includes civil matters, such as if you choose to build, you require Israeli permits in Area C, where if you choose to build in Area B and A, for the most part, you require Palestinian permits and licensing.
Thank you. Very clear. Any suggestions for strategy for BDS, i.e. particular businesses, corporations? Would South Africa join this?
Yeah, I think South Africa, or many movements and organizations within South Africa, are some of the first that joined and supported the BDS movement. And many different nations have some form of BDS foundation or support network, in which you can Google, for instance, BDS North America, and it'll give you a list of the different businesses, organizations, or corporations that you should try and boycott or try to divest from. But one thing I will say is, for those who wish to engage in BDS, if you have the time and the resources, I would suggest that you don't simply divest and that be the end of your action. I would suggest that you divest and you send a letter, send an email, make some sort of written explanation as to why you divested. Because one of the things that's oftentimes lost on this BDS movement is it's not a movement that is meant to weaken Israel. It's a movement that's meant to exert economic pressure on Israel, explaining that this economic pressure or divestment comes because as a reaction of the continuous illegal practices of oppression by the Israeli state and occupation. And that way making it clear that it's not that we don't wish to engage in economic practices or relationships with you. It's just that we choose not to be complicit in this injustice. And underlying that is that we believe there is a better alternative, that there is a better way. And within this, especially for those who are friends and supporters of the state of Israel, Israel is oftentimes referred to as the only democracy in the Middle East. And for us Palestinians, sometimes all we can say is inshallah, hopefully one day, but that is not the reality that we experience today. But the other side of this is the best thing Israel can do for its security is to make peace and to build positive peace with its Palestinian neighbors.
Thank you. We have time for just a couple. We have about 7 minutes left with our promise to end at 11:30. You are in Malta now. Is it safe for you to return to Palestine? Or if not safe, will it be even logistically possible?
Yes, so far, yes. I am lucky enough to be a Palestinian with Palestinian citizenship, which means that Israel may decide, of course, or Israel is responsible or in control of the borders. And at the moment, I have the legal right under all legislations to come to the West Bank and exit and enter freely according to the timetable or schedules of the different borders which I'm able to use. At the moment, I can only travel through the King Hussein border crossing, also known as the Lembi crossing. And if I choose to use another border, I require Israeli military permission. But there's also a number of Palestinians who aren't able to leave the territory for one reason or another, which includes their activism, such as some of the BDS founders and supporters, especially in Ramallah, have dots by their name and they are unable to traverse the borders. But there is a very large number of Palestinians, in fact, over half of the whole Palestinian population in the world is unable to access Palestine. But with my citizenship, that gives me at least some guarantees, if all things are normal, that I am able to enter and exit freely and only inhibit area A and B and predominantly Bethlehem if there are any security threats or if there's any escalation of violence.
Thank you. This is another long explanation with the question embedded, and I think you're reading it too. So, the U.S. government has become increasingly complicit in enabling Israel to treat Palestinians in these, quote, unlawful ways that aren't comparable to most world standards of human rights. How can we or others provide informational support to those of us, i.e. organizations and individuals in the US who might be interested in publicly and effectively pushing back on US policies supporting Israel's unlawful apartheid practices on Palestinians' lives and on Israeli lives and lies? Done.
Well, thank you for that excellent question. The first thing, and this is something that you will see if you look up We Am on our sign and on our website, we have an invitation which is not just from We Am, but echoed by many of the Palestinian communities and by Palestinian NGOs, and that is come and see. And so that is remain connected, but especially if you have not experienced Palestine, Israel, please come and see and connect to everyone there. But make sure that you come and connect to the Palestinian community as well, because that is oftentimes the community, especially when people come on religious pilgrimages, that they are unable to connect to. And the other part of this is continue to browse our websites, email us, email other Palestinian organizations. There are many terrific Palestinian NGOs, organizations, human rights organizations that are dedicated to advocacy. I would say if you have the time, resources, or audience, just like MEPN does, invite us to speak to you, to your group, to your congregation, to your organization, to your university, and invite Palestinians within your communities that are organizing and that are related to advocacy work to come and speak. And within this, I would say, as best as you can, continue to follow the news, but make sure you have that human interaction or dimension. Don't simply see what the media reports, but also remain in contact with your peace workers, peace builders, friends, whatever you'd like to call them, on the ground to see what it's like for them, what the lived experiences are. And I think follow the policies and practices of your government. I think especially in one of the bills in the US as it related to COVID and it related to COVID aid for Americans, one of the things that was thrown in there was support for Israel. So I think follow the policies of your governments, of your legislators, and be relentless in your asking for justice and justice building, while also affirming that this is not a zero-sum game unless we allow it to be, that this can be and is in nature a win-win solution where Palestinian rights and Palestinian sovereignty and freedom and self-determination comes with Israeli rights, Israeli sovereignty, and security for both.
Thank you. That concludes our Q&A. If you posed a question and I did not get to it, apologies, but we are out of time. I have posted the WEAM website in the chat. I invite all of you to browse it. I love what it says. If you come, it says, come, see, and act. Let me get this on. You are welcome to visit WEAM Center, make coffee, tea, and not walls. Join us for coffee and chat about social, economic, political, and religious issues. So all are welcome, clearly. Very important work, and we thank you for not only the presentation, but how articulate you are in expressing your views and reality on the ground. We thank you for that. Shukran. As always, today's forum recording will be posted on our website, and bear with us, it might take a couple of weeks. We will also send out a short evaluation for you to complete in a post-forum email. This is normally in the chat, but my limited abilities as technician allowed me did not allow me to do it. We will not have a December forum. Please watch your emails for announcement for our January speaker. And finally, if you are new to MEPN forums and like what you see and hear, please consider becoming a member through donation. Link has been posted in the chat. No, it's not posted in the chat, but go to our website to give via givemin.org. That is our main giving way. If you do it by credit card, if you would prefer to write a check, you may send the check to MEPN. And once again, that is in our website, MEPN.org. On behalf of the board, old and new, we thank you for your support and we look forward to seeing you at future forums. Have a great day, everybody. Thank you.